When I found him bleeding by the river, everyone said he was dangerous. But there was something in the way he looked at me, and despite everything, I took him to the barn. I was coming back from checking the south fence line when I saw him. He was slumped near the riverbank, shirt torn, blood soaking the dirt around him. The red ran into the stream like paint spilling in water. I froze. Out here, miles from the nearest town, seeing anyone, let alone a man like him, was rare. His long black hair, the marks on his arms, the way he gripped his side. I knew what the neighbors would say. Apache. Trouble. Leave him. But something stopped me from walking away. He didn't speak. Not a word. But his eyes met mine. With something I can't explain. Not fear. Not a plea. Just quiet. Like he'd already accepted whatever was going to happen. And for some reason, that look stayed with me. It pierced straight through my worry, my memories, even my better judgment. I loaded him onto the wagon without telling a soul. By nightfall, he was on the floor of my barn, wrapped in an old quilt I hadn't touched since my husband died. I cleaned the wound the best I could, praying he wouldn't die, or worse, wake up angry. I kept a rifle close, just in case. But each time I looked at him, something inside me shifted. Like I was standing on the edge of something I didn't yet understand. The next morning, I told myself I'd take him to town once he could walk. That's what I said. But days passed, and I didn't. Not because I was afraid, not exactly. It was because I needed to know why. Why did I feel like saving him wasn't just a choice, but a reckoning? For 3 days, he didn't speak. Not once. He'd wake, eyes glassy with fever, then drift back into that in-between place where pain pulls you under like quicksand. I fed him spoonfuls of broth when he could swallow, wiped his forehead with cool water, and kept checking the barn door to be sure no one had followed the trail I tried to cover. It was strange, caring for someone whose name I didn't even know. I thought about asking a simple question, really. But every time I opened my mouth, something stopped me. Maybe it was the way he stared into the rafters, like he was listening for something I couldn't hear. Or maybe I was afraid of what the name would mean. A name makes someone real. A name ties them to stories. And stories stick. He watched me sometimes, those dark eyes never blinking. It didn't feel threatening, but it didn't feel safe either. Like he was reading something written on my face, maybe something I didn't want read. On the third evening, I sat beside him with a lantern and said softly, "You got a name?" Nothing. I tried again. I can't just keep calling you, "Hey you." He looked away, jaw tight. Then finally, his voice, rough like sandpaper. "Names are for those who can still carry them." I didn't understand what that meant. Not then. But the weight of it hung in the air like smoke. I nodded, even though it made no sense, and whispered, "All right. You don't have to tell me, not yet." That night, I dreamed of fire. Not flames, but the feeling of fire. Heat without light, something burning slow beneath the earth. I woke with the taste of ash in my mouth. And when I went to the barn to check on him, he was already sitting up, staring at the wall like he'd been waiting for me. And behind him, in the dirt near the barn's entrance, were fresh footprints. Barefoot. Large. More than one pair. I stood there for a long moment, just staring at the marks in the dust. They were clear as day, not made by boots or work shoes, but bare feet. 5 sets, maybe more. The dry soil around the barn was undisturbed the day before, I was sure of it. I had swept it myself to cover the wagon tracks, so whoever had come quietly. Too quietly. I stepped closer, trying to trace the pattern. The footprints circled the barn, stopping by the back wall, as if someone had stood there listening, watching. Then they vanished toward the edge of the cottonwoods, where the river curved out of sight. I followed them a few feet before they faded into the hard-packed earth, the wind already working to erase them. Back inside, he hadn't moved. Still sitting up, hands folded in his lap, eyes distant. "You have visitors?" I asked, half joking, trying to mask the unease in my voice. Didn't smile, didn't blink, just said, "They're watching. They won't speak until it's time." Time for what? He didn't answer. That silence, it filled the room more than any sound could, like something ancient had just brushed past me and left a chill behind. I wanted to believe it was nothing, just animals, maybe some kids messing around, but deep down, I knew better. Later that day, I rode into town for supplies. The usual route, the usual people. But everything felt off. Folks nodded, but their eyes lingered a beat too long. Mrs. McCrae, the postmaster's wife, didn't even say hello, just stared from her porch like she'd seen a ghost. Or like I was one. As I packed flour and salt into my saddlebag, Mr. Fletcher from the feed store said, almost under his breath, "You ought to be careful out there. Not everyone out here forgets history so easy." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't have to. When I got back home, the barn door was still closed. The light was dim. But carved into the inside of the wood, something I hadn't seen before, was a mark. A symbol, a kind of spiral inside a handprint. And I knew I hadn't put it there. The day after the footprints, I went back into town, partly for kerosene, partly because I couldn't shake the feeling that something was tightening around me. Like a rope pulled slow, it was in the air, in the way birds scattered too fast when I stepped onto the porch, in how even the wind felt like it was listening. As I rode down Main Street, I caught her eyes before she turned away, Mrs. McCrae. She was standing outside the dry goods store, arms crossed, apron dusted with flour. Normally she'd wave, maybe ask after the chickens or gossip about the Bennett's boys getting into trouble again. But this time, nothing. Just that long, hard stare. She didn't look angry. That would have been easier. What she looked like was disappointed. Like I'd broken something delicate she thought I still knew how to hold. Inside the store, people talked quieter when I walked past. The room felt colder. A little girl I didn't recognize clung to her mother's skirt and pointed at me, whispering. I heard one word, Indian, before the mother hushed her and turned her away. No one said anything directly, but it was in their faces. Whatever they thought I was hiding, they believed it was true. Back outside, I passed Mrs. McCrae again. She didn't stop me, but she spoke loud enough for only me to hear. Your father had his secrets too, she said, eyes fixed on a spot over my shoulder. But he kept them buried. Maybe you should have done the same. I wanted to ask what she meant. I wanted to ask how she knew anything at all. But the words stuck. Because deep down, a part of me knew this wasn't just about the man in the barn. This was about something older, something that had started long before I ever found him by the river. When I got home, I didn't go to the barn right away. I sat on the front steps, trying to remember anything my father might have said about the land, about the Apaches, about the history no one liked to talk about. I remembered something faint. A night when I was a child, hearing my father and a stranger arguing outside. Harsh whispers. The words, agreement and debt. And then, silence. In the barn that evening, the wounded man looked stronger. He asked for water, his voice clearer now. I handed him the tin cup, and as he drank, he looked me in the eye. You don't remember, he said softly. But you will. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying his words. You don't remember, but you will. Like a bell that kept ringing in my head long after the sound had stopped. So I went looking. Not for answers exactly, but for something. Anything. The old roll-top desk in my father's study hadn't been touched since the funeral. I kept it mostly closed, more out of habit than grief. It still smelled like his pipe tobacco and leather. He was a quiet man, stoic, the kind who thought emotions were something you kept under lock and key, along with your secrets. I pulled open drawer after drawer, sifting through brittle tax papers, old maps, a faded wedding photo. And then I found it, tucked in a false bottom beneath the lowest drawer. A bundle of letters tied with a rawhide strip, aged and weathered. Some addressed to names I didn't recognize. Some never addressed at all. The handwriting was my father's, tight, deliberate. And what he wrote, well, it took my breath. To Chief Nantan, I've kept my word, but there are voices stirring again. They want the land back, and they won't ask nicely. He was just a boy, but I had no choice. I gave him safe passage and told them he drowned. I fear my daughter will carry the weight of what I've done. If the time comes, tell her the truth. But gently. She deserves peace, not punishment. My hands trembled. There were 8 letters. Not one had been sent. The dates stretched over nearly 2 decades. All postmarked before my father died. They spoke of deals, cover-ups, of hiding someone or something. And always the same undercurrent. Guilt. I sat there until morning, the light creeping through the curtains like a slow confession. None of it made sense. But it did confirm one thing. Whatever was happening now wasn't just chance. I hadn't found the Apache by accident. Back in the barn, he was standing when I opened the door, still weak but upright. He looked at me, not like a stranger anymore, but like someone who'd been waiting for me to wake up. "You found the letters," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded slowly. "You knew my father." He didn't answer, just turned toward the barn door and said, "They're coming." That night, the wind didn't stop. It howled low through the cottonwoods, brushing against the windows like fingertips. I didn't light the lamps. I sat in the dark, listening to the wind, to the creaks in the wood, to the breath of the house itself. Something was shifting. I could feel it. Not just in me, not just in him. The land felt different, like it was holding its breath. I didn't sleep. At some point past midnight, I stepped out onto the porch. No moon, no stars, just a heavy sky and the sound of something distant, something moving. By the time the sun began to rise, its light, dull and pale, they were there. A line of men stood at the edge of the property, still as statues. 7, maybe 8, dressed in leather, feathers, worn cloth, paint on their faces that the morning mist couldn't blur. They didn't speak, didn't move, just watched. I didn't recognize any of them, but I knew what they were. Apache warriors. Real ones. Not from stories, not from books. My heart pounded, but I didn't run. I didn't call for help. I just stood there barefoot in my nightgown, gripping the porch rail like it could anchor me. He stepped out of the barn beside me. Stronger now, steady. He didn't look surprised to see them. He didn't say anything either, just nodded once. A gesture that felt like it carried more history than I could begin to understand. The warriors made no reply, no words, no signal, just silence. I turned to him, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are they here for me?" He looked at me, the corners of his mouth tense. "They're here for the truth." And just like that, I knew this wasn't about danger. It wasn't even about vengeance. It was about reckoning, and whatever my father had done, whatever part I now played, they expected me to answer for it. The warriors stayed. They didn't cross the fence line, didn't raise a weapon, didn't shout. They simply stood, dawn to dusk, like the land itself had sent them. I went about my chores the best I could, trying to ignore the weight of their presence, but I felt it, every second, in my chest, in my bones. He stayed inside the barn most of that day, resting, watching, and as evening settled in, I brought him bread, water, and the question I hadn't dared ask until now. "Who are you?" He took the cup from my hands, sipped slowly, then looked me in the eye. "My name is Taza," he said. "Son of Kale." I said nothing, but something about the name hit like a cold wind, familiar and foreign at the same time. He continued, voice low but steady. "Your father saved me. I was 12. Soldiers were coming, hunting those who wouldn't. Leave the mountains. He hid me in this barn, right where I laid bleeding a week ago. I tried to breathe, but my throat was tight. He swore he'd protect me, said he owed a debt to my father. But after that night, I never saw him again. Just a letter, years later. Said he couldn't risk it, said he had a daughter now, and couldn't let the past touch her." I sat down on the hay beside him, the quiet between us thick with things unspoken. "He thought protecting me meant forgetting you," I said softly. Taza nodded. "And now that he's gone, they wonder where his loyalties ended. If he lied. If you would carry what he started. I wanted to scream that I didn't ask for any of this, that I didn't know. But deep down, I knew that didn't matter. The choice had already been made the moment I took him into that barn. They're not here to kill," Taza said. "They're here to see, to decide if the blood you carry means the promise is still alive or broken." Outside, the sun slipped behind the hills. The line of warriors didn't move, but somehow I could feel them listening. It was just before midnight when the lantern flickered low and I noticed it. A pale line of scar tissue stretching across Taza's chest, curving just beneath his collarbone. Not a bullet wound. Older, deeper, etched like something ceremonial. I reached out instinctively but stopped myself. "What is that?" I asked. He looked down at it, fingers grazing the mark as if it still carried heat. "It was given when I was a child, before the night your father hid me. It's a rite, a binding." "To what?" He didn't speak right away, just turned toward the wall, where the faint shadows from the lantern danced across the barnwood. "To a promise made. Long before either of us were born," he said at last. Then he did something unexpected. He unwrapped a piece of cloth from around his wrist, carefully unfolded it, and held it out to me. Inside was an old, tarnished ring, silver, with a small turquoise stone set in the center. I knew that ring. It had belonged to my father. I remembered it clear as day. He used to wear it on Sundays, polished it with a handkerchief he kept in his vest. I hadn't seen it since the funeral. I'd assumed it had been buried with him, or maybe lost in the shuffle of grief. "How did you get this?" I asked, my voice catching. "He gave it to me," Taza said. "Said if I ever returned here, and you were alive, to show you. Said you'd understand when the time came." I didn't understand. Not fully. But my hands were trembling as I touched. The ring. It was real. Heavy. And it unlocked something. A memory, faint but sharp. I was maybe 7, sitting on my father's lap. He was telling me a story I thought was made up, about a boy who lived between worlds, who carried a secret the wind couldn't steal, a boy who had to disappear so the truth could live. I thought it was just a bedtime tale, but the boy was real. He had a name, a face, a scar, and now he was asking me what I would do with the legacy my father had left behind. Outside, I heard the soft crunch of footsteps in dry grass. The warriors were moving. At dawn, I opened the front door, and they were closer. The warriors had moved in the night, not with force, not with threat, but with quiet certainty. They now stood in a wide semicircle just beyond the barn. Still no words, just eyes, watching. Measuring Taza stood beside me. He didn't flinch, didn't speak. He just stepped forward, slow and steady, and raised the silver ring high enough for them to see. No reaction. Then he turned to me and said, "Now it's you they're waiting on." I looked at the faces before me, painted, weathered, unmoved. The silence was heavier than any shout. It wasn't just about what I'd done. It was about who I chose to be now. Whether I'd stand in the shadow of what my father hid, or step into the light of what he tried to protect. I went back inside. My hands moved on their own, gathering the letters, the ring, and the old family Bible with the blank pages in the back. I brought them all outside and laid them on the ground between us. "This is what he left me," I said, voice breaking. His name, his guilt, his silence. I looked to Taza, then back to the warriors. But I won't carry his silence, not anymore. I reached down, tore out the blank pages from the Bible, the ones meant for recording births, deaths, and marriages, and handed them to Taza. "You tell me what to write," I said, "and I'll write it." One of the warriors, older than the rest, eyes deep and unreadable, stepped forward. He crouched beside the pile, picked up one of the letters, and read it silently. Then he stood. No nod, no smile, just a slight shift in his shoulders, as if some invisible burden had lifted. Without a word, they turned. One by one, they walked back toward the tree line, disappearing like shadows at sunrise. Taza looked at me, and in his face, I saw something I hadn't seen since this all began. Peace. But peace always comes at a cost. They never came back, not the warriors, not the glances from town. The silence they left behind wasn't heavy anymore. It was clean, like breath after rain. Taza stayed for a while. Days turned into weeks. We rebuilt the old shed together, cleared brush from the fence line, talked less than we listened. Sometimes he'd speak of his father, of stories told beside firelight. Stories my people had either erased or rewritten, and I listened, not out of guilt, out of need. One morning, he came to the porch with his satchel packed. "I have to go," he said simply. I nodded. I knew. There was no dramatic goodbye, no promises or regrets. Just the quiet understanding that we had each done what we needed to do. He handed me the ring, the one my father gave him, and said, "Keep it. It belongs with the truth now." After he left, I found myself walking the land more often. I saw it differently now, not as property, but as inheritance. Not in the legal sense, but in the deeper, older way. Stories had happened here. People had lived, lost, healed, and some of that was in my blood. Whether I knew it or not, I started writing. Not fiction, truth. What happened here. What my father did. What I did. I sent the letters to places I'd never heard of before. Tribal councils, historical archives, newspapers that wouldn't return my calls. I didn't care if they printed them. I just needed the story to be somewhere other than my head. The ranch still stands. It's quiet most days. The river runs slow, and the cottonwoods hum when the wind comes through just right. And every now and then, when I see footprints I didn't leave, I don't cover them up. I leave them be. Because sometimes the past doesn't need to be buried. Sometimes it just needs to be seen.
If you've made it this far, it means this story touched you in some way. So don't leave without subscribing. It really helps the channel and keeps me motivated to share more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And which part of this story moved you the most?